Introduction. Freedom fighter, reckless thug, hero, saint. Children still play a game called Bar Kokhba and the Romans, and I have talked with adults who recall playing it in their youth in New York, Eastern Europe, or Palestine. It became traditional, wrote Yigal Yadin, about the custom for children of Jewish communities in Eastern Europe to go into the fields at the festival of Lag BaOmer and play Bar Kokhba and the Romans, with makeshift bows and arrows, as Western children play cowboys and Indians, or Robin Hood. Footnote. Yigal Yadin, Bar Kokhba, New York, 1971, 27. End of footnote. In the State of Israel, there are streets and sports teams named after Bar Kokhba, and kindergarten children learn a song by Levin Kipnis. There was a man in Israel named Bar Kokhba, a man young and tall with eyes that shone. He was brave and called for liberty. The people all loved him because he was brave. Similarly, the Israeli Children's Encyclopedia Tarbut teaches its young readers that Bar Kokhba bequeathed a legacy of supreme heroism. Indeed, many Israelis today admire Bar Kokhba as a great national hero, a symbol of self-sacrificing courage in the service of national liberation and revival. But Bar Kokhba has long been a hero of the political right in Zionist thought, and the name of Beitar organization, a militant Zionist youth movement, began in 1923, alludes to the fortress where Bar Kokhba made his last stand. As head of the organization in the 1930s, Vladimir Jabotinsky, founder of Zionist revisionism, shaped it to teach Jewish youth not only martial skills but pride and nobility of spirit. He told them they were heirs to the proud, heroic tradition of the Maccabees and Bar Kokhba. Menachem Begin, as commander of Irgun, the revisionist parliamentary organization in British Palestine, called up the figure of Bar Kokhba in a public radio address of 1948. In this speech, he declared that the spirit of our ancient heroes, including the rebels of Judea, the Maccabees, and Bar Kokhba, will go with Israel's fighters into battle as they smite the enemy and bring freedom to the suffering Jewish people. In the Chains, a novel by Gerald Green, 1981, the story of Bar Kokhba is cited by Jewish members of an American labor union to justify employing Jake Chain as a Jewish tough to defend them in the picket line. But Paul Brains, author of Tough Jews, 1990, expresses dismiss over the new trend he finds among American Jews, evidenced by The Chains and many other recent novels of admiring tough Jews over the older traditional stereotype of gentle Jews. Footnotes. Yehoshaphat Harkabi, The Bar Kokhba Syndrome, trans Max Tickton, New York, 1983, 103 to 104, Jonathan Frankel, Bar Kokhba and All That, Descent, 31, 1984, 192 to 202. The name Betar is an abbreviation for Brit Trumpeter, Covenant of Trumpeter. Joseph Trumpeter exemplified the ideas of pioneering military defense and self-sacrifice espoused by the Beitar movement. But the word so formed, Beitar, alludes to Bar Kokhba's fortress. The sites of this fortress and of Yodafet, a stronghold of Bar Kokhba's soldiers in the Galilee, became places of pilgrimage for Beitar members. Ehud, Sprinzak, The Ascendants of Israel's Radical Right, New York, 1991. 26. Walter Lacour, A History of Zionism, New York, 1976, 357 to 361. Joseph Schickman, The Jabotinsky Story, Volume 2, Fighter and Prophet, New York, 1961. 411, Charles Lieberman and Elazar Don Yahia, Civil Religion in Israel, Berkeley and Los Angeles, 1983 to 79. Fourth footnote. Robert Rowland, The Rhetoric of Menachem Begin, The Myth of Redemption Through Return. Lanham, M.D., 1985, 256 to 257. In the same speech, Begin proclaimed the wonderful youth of the reborn Hebrew army equal to the great soldiers of Bar Kokhba, 252. Fifth footnote. Paul Brains, Tough Jews, New York, 1990, 116 to 117. Gerald Green, The Chains, New York, 1981, 62. Brains also discusses the rise of the Zionist ideal of toughness during the last century, and in doing so, points to the establishment of Bar Kokhba gymnastic clubs in Europe around 1900 in response to an appeal by the Zionist leader Max Nordau that Jews build hardy athletic bodies as part of their national revival. Let us once again become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men, proclaimed Nordau, and Bar Kokhba's name became connected with this effort. 142 to 143. End of those footnotes. In the historical romance If I Forget Thee, 1985, by Brenda Leslie Segal, Bar Kokhba is an emotionally scarred warrior needing a woman's love. In the complex theological novel by Arthur Cohen, In the Days of Simon Stern, 1972, Bar Kokhba appears under a different guise as something of an existentialist hero enacting a redemptive role as Messiah of his time. Footnote. Arthur Cohen, In the Days of Simon Stern, New York, 1972. Bar Kokhba appears throughout the book and as the historical figure on 462 to 463. The name Simon Stern is itself a play on the full Hebrew name Shimon Bar Kokhba. The German word Stern, Kokhba, star in Aramaic. End of footnote. These are the few of the ways in which Bar Kokhba is remembered today. He lives on in games and street signs, in novels, and in political and historical consciousness. And like all significant figures of the past, Bar Kokhba presents us with a variety of faces. His life, as in these examples, reveals different meanings to different people. Who was Bar Kokhba? That, in a sense, is the subject of this book. It is a history of the perceptions that Jewish writers of the 4th through the 17th centuries, many of them famous and influential, formed of this military leader. Studying the writings of this period, containing what can be called traditional or pre-modern images of Bar Kokhba, allows us to compare the classical rabbinic images of him with several later patterns of their modification, some of which, especially in the 16th century, seem to lead toward his picture in modern secular historiography. My procedure will be to examine the literary passages that speak of Bar Kokhba and try to understand them in the context of the books in which they appear and the author's other writings. Sometimes literary strands that make up a particular image can be traced. I then ask several questions about each image, how it is related to the author's political and philosophical ideas, and the social and political setting in which he lived, What attitudes or messages are expressed in each account of Bar Kokhba? What in particular are its political and religious implications? Each new image of Bar Kokhba can be compared with relevant older images to identify significant distinctions. In this way, I build up a history of images and look for larger patterns in the changes. What we are seeking, then, is a history of perceptions and meanings, the varied perceptions that Jewish writers formed of Bar Kokhba, and the changing contemporary meanings history revealed as it was told and retold over the centuries. Specialized period studies, with their intensive research into single cultural settings and literatures, cannot offer us this kind of perspective upon changes occurring over a long span of time. We must employ the broader and less exact tools of a comparative history, examining documents from diverse cultural settings and historical periods. As much as possible, I follow the guidance of specialized studies in interpreting particular periods and documents, but my subject is both more limited, the image of Bar Kokhba, and more inclusive, a history of images extending beyond any one period. This is political and religious history revealed in the changing garb of a legendary hero, villain, and his story. The changes that occur in that story over time, reflecting changes, features of Jewish life, open windows onto some of the various worlds and crises of Jewish history. The modern historian's picture. So who was Bar Kokhba? In the literature we shall study, ideas about who he was were based on legends told about him in rabbinic literature and on reports found in Greek and Latin chronicles. These legends and reports will occupy our attention in the first 2 chapters of this book. But first, to provide readers with a familiar type of image, and for purposes of comparison, I summarize what modern historians say about Bar Kokhba. They base their ideas about him on several different sources of information, to which they give differing degrees of credence. They place the most trust in archaeological evidence, letters, coins, inscriptions, habitations, roads, and other remains from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Somewhat less credence is given to the Roman and Greek references to the events, the longest and most important being that of Dio Cassius in the Byzantine epitome of Xiphilinus. Secondary evidence is accepted with reservations from the writings of the Church Fathers and with greater reservations from rabbinic traditions about Bar Kokhba, but only if logic and external evidence support a tradition. There are, of course, good reasons for evaluating the sources in the order, but these reasons assume different values, almost a mirror opposite concept of authority from that found in most of the Jewish literature we shall study. Several new and important studies of the revolt led by Bar Kokhba have been published in the last 20 years. Benjamin Isaac and Aaron Oppenheimer attribute this surge of interest to a new appreciation for the historical importance of the revolt, to spectacular new archaeological discoveries from the time of Bar Kokhba, including letters written by the man himself, and to the tendency of contemporary Israelis to identify with ancient Jews who fought heroic battles against foreign empires. Footnote: Benjamin Isaac and Aaron Oppenheimer, The Revolt of Bar Kokhba, Ideology and Modern Scholarship, JJS 36, 1985, 34-35. The right-wing Israeli politician and writer Israel Eldad, found a sublime meaning in Yigal Yadin's discovery in 1960 of actual letters written by Bar Kokhba. To Eldad, these letters from the last commander of an organized Jewish army had been waiting to be read by the first commander of the Jewish army of today. Yadin was operational commander during Israel's War of Independence. This was a miraculous sign proving that the Jewish nation and army had been destined to be reborn in our time. Eldad, The Jewish Revolution, Jewish Statehood, Translation, Hannah Shemorak, New York, 1971, pages 84 to 87, pages 106 to 107. End of footnote. By the standards of modern historiography, the most important of recent writings about Bar Kokhba are Geza Vermes and Fergus Miller's 1973 revision of Emil Schröer's classic, The History of the Jewish People in the Age of Jesus Christ, Shimon Applebaum's Prolegomena to the Study of the Second Jewish Revolt, 1976, various essays by Aaron Oppenheimer, as well as his anthology of older scholars, The Bar Kokhba Revolt, 1980, and his collection with Uriel Rappaport of recent Israeli scholarship, The Bar Kokhba Revolt, New Studies, 1984, both in Hebrew, and Peter Schaefer's Der Bar Kokhba Ausfund, 1981. The Israeli scholarship shows the clear influence of the historians Gedalia Elon and Shmuley Yavin, whose work in the 1950s on the revolt began to use a combination of rabbinic, archaeological, and classical sources in a sophisticated way. Isaac and Oppenheimer, reviewing the recent scholarship in their essay, The Revolt of Bar Kokhba, Ideology and Modern Scholarship, 1985, discovered that the pictures of the revolt presented by modern scholars reflect their personal conceptions of the Roman Empire and Jewish people, Greek and Roman culture, the Jewish religion. Israeli historians, for example, often see the result as an heroic struggle against Roman oppression. Other scholars, taking a Roman viewpoint, see Bar Kokhba as a pious thug. Footnote: G.W. Bowerstock, A Roman Perspective on the Bar Kokhba Revolt, Approaches to Ancient Judaism, 2 edition, William S. Green, Chicago, California, 1980, pages 131 to 141. See Shimon Applebaum's Critique, Points of View on the Second Jewish Revolt, Scripta Classica Israelica, 7, 1983 to 84, pages 77 to 87. End of footnote. Even estimates of Bar Kokhba's military achievements imply ideological viewpoints. If he succeeded in controlling Jerusalem and a large area of land for a considerable time, his revolt appears heroic. But if he failed to capture land beyond the Judean hills, then his cause appears to have been a rash and hopeless form from the beginning. Footnote: Isaac and Oppenheimer, Revolt of Bar Kokhba, pages 35 to 36, and page 55. End of footnote. Modern scholarship thus disagrees over many aspects of Bar Kokhba's life and the revolt he led, and important questions remain unsolved. Isaac and Oppenheimer open their essay with the minimal picture of the revolt that nearly all scholars agree upon. Jewish armed resistance against Roman rule in Judea reached its culmination and exhausted itself in the revolt of Bar Kokhba. Great numbers of rebels participated in the insurrection, employing guerrilla tactics, and large reinforcements were needed to suppress it. The rebels were united under the leadership of one man, Bar Kokhba. The revolt resulted in the emergence of a kind of independent state. marked by the organization of local authorities, the issue of coinage, and the leasing of state land. Footnote: Abid 33. End of footnote. Almost everything else about Bar Kokhba and the revolt is problematic. The following picture of it summarizes the views of a majority of scholars while also indicating areas of disagreement. I follow in particular the account by Vermes and Miller and the essay by Isaac and Oppenheimer. 11th footnote. Abid 33-60. Emil Schwerer, The History of the Jewish People in the Age of Jesus Christ. Rev. and edited. Geza Vermes and Fergus Miller, Edinburgh, 1973. 1. 534 to 557. And page 606. End of footnote. Bar Kokhba, then, was the leader of this last Judean revolt against Rome, lasting from around 132 to 135 CE. The recently discovered letters show that his given name was Shimon bar Kokhba. The name Bar Kokhba, which is a messianic allusion, was bestowed on him by people who believed that he was the promised king who would free Israel and rebuild the temple that had been destroyed 60 years earlier. Just how many people believed this about him is unclear. Most scholars, on the basis of a rabbinic legend, think that one man who believed it was Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph, the foremost rabbinic authority of the day, but scholars disagree as to how many other sages shared Rabbi Akiba's opinion. In any case, large numbers of Judean Jews joined the revolt, apparently in hope of gaining freedom from Rome and rebuilding the temple, which are messianic hopes. Gedalia Alon, applying modern political concepts, considers the revolt a war of national liberation that took the form of a messianic movement. Peter Schaeffer, however, warns us that the Jewish thought of that time did not distinguish a messianic war from any other political war, and that there is no way to corroborate the rabbinic tradition connecting Rabbi Akiba with Bar Kokhba or the revolt. Furthermore, Schaeffer conceives of the war along the pattern of the earlier Hasmonean uprising. A small number of strictly pious Jews began a guerrilla war against the objections of a majority who prefer the status quo under the Roman government. Hence, he views the revolt as smaller in scope and consequence than do other scholars. Footnote: Peter Schaeffer, Der Bar Kokhba Aufstand, Tübingen, 1981, pages 45 to 50. Chapter 3, pages 168 to 169. Schaeffer, Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba, Approaches to Ancient Judaism. 2, pages 113 to 130. Schaeffer, The Causes of the Bar Kokhba Revolt, Studies in Agadah, Targum, and Jewish Liturgy, in memory of Joseph Heinemann. Edited. Jacob Petakowski and Ezra Fleischer, Jerusalem, 1981, pages 74 to 94. See also the critiques by Oppenheimer, JJS 14, 217 to 220, and Harry Sisling, Bibliotheca Orientalis, 40, 1983, 717 to 722, both of whom question Schaeffer's atomistic methodology and his comparison of the Bar Kokhba revolt with the Hasmonean revolt. End of footnote. Coins minted by the revolutionaries, as well as their letters, show that Bar Kokhba's official title was Nezi Yisrael. Nezi Yisrael. Prince of Israel. Some of the coins bear the image of a star above the figure of a temple. Some bear the inscriptions for the freedom of Israel. Year 1 of the liberation of Israel. Year 2 of the freedom of Israel. These coins, while not proof that Bar Kokhba's forces captured Jerusalem, do show what Bar Kokhba fought for. Further information is provided by newly found documents from which we learn, for example, that his government was strong, centralized, and authoritarian, that he imposed harsh discipline on the forces, and that he made efforts to observe religious rituals strictly, particularly rituals relating to the land such as Sukkot, booths, and tithing. Scholars remain divided in their explanations of the revolt's cause. Some argue that the underlying cause was the Jews' desire to regain independence and rebuild the temple. This hope had burned in the people's hearts for 60 years, igniting incidents of local unrest until it finally flamed into active revolt. It has been suggested that the Pharisees fanned this hope by instituting prayers for the rebuilding of the temple, or that a priestly leadership actively incited the hope. Alternatively, Shimon Applebaum views the revolt as primarily a peasant uprising, engendered by expropriation and oppressive tenurial conditions. Footnote: Isaac and Oppenheimer, Revolt of Bar Kokhba, 45. See Applebaum. Prolegomena to the study of the Second Jewish Revolt. Oxford, 1976, pages 9 to 17, Applebaum. The Second Jewish Revolt, AD, pages 131 to 135, Palestine Exploration Quarterly, 116, 1984, pages 35 to 37. End of footnote. The immediate cause of the revolt is likewise problematic. Most scholars think that a general Roman ban against circumcision had first angered the Jews, and then this anger erupted into active military preparations when Hadrian began to transform Jerusalem into a pagan city, or announced plans to found a Roman temple to Jupiter Capitolinus on the site where the Jewish people had stood. Other scholars look for the revolt's cause more in what they consider Jewish fanaticism than in any particular actions of Hadrian, which they view as prudent and cosmopolitan. Most of the fighting took place in Judea proper. There is no consensus about whether the war spread to the Galilee or whether Jerusalem was captured by the Jews. Schaeffer and Boserstock think the city renamed in Roman hands, but many scholars think it was indeed captured, although never rebuilt. The rebels achieved dramatic victories at first. Through guerrilla tactics, they defeated the Roman army stationed in Judea and then organized an independent state. Hadrian had to bring in large numbers of troops from other provinces as reinforcements. According to Dio Cassius, he assigned command of these forces to Julius Severus, one of the best generals. Severus then began the task of suppressing the revolt by hunting out the rebels a few at a time, cutting off their supplies and fighting them in long and costly individual battles. Slowly, he succeeded. The rebels lost ground and had to concentrate their forces in the mountain stronghold of Beitar, which stood near the present site of Bitar, 6 miles southwest of Jerusalem. After a long, stubborn resistance, the fortress was conquered in the 18th year of Hadrian, 134 to 135. Rabbinic traditions, supported only by Eusebius, assert that this was where Bar Kokhba died, along with his soldiers and the town's civilian population. Vermes and Miller described the revolt as an uprising that in scope, dynamic power, and destructive consequences was at least as violent as that of the time of Vespasian. It is only due to the relative poverty of the sources that it has seemed less important. Footnote. Vermes and Miller, eds. In Schurer, History of the Jewish People, Volume 1, pages 542 to 543. End of footnote. Casualties were enormous on both sides, according to Dio. Roman losses were so great that Hadrian, writing to the Senate, omitted the usual opening formula, "I and the legions are in health." As to Jewish losses, Dio reported that the whole of Judea was made desolate. 580,000 Jews had fallen in battle, and innumerable others had died of starvation and illness. Most of the survivors were sold as slaves and sent to Gaza or Egypt. Applebaum finds archaeological correlation for these figures. In the end, Jerusalem was turned into a Roman colony, and the temple to Jupiter was built as planned. Heavy Roman taxes, as well as the devastation, brought a grave economic crisis in Judea, which forced many of the remaining Jews to emigrate. Footnotes. Dio Cassius, Roman History, Trans. E. Cary Loeb, Classical Library, 1925, 8:447-51. See Benjamin Isaac, Cassius Dio on the Revolt of Bar Kokhba, Scripta Classica Israelitica, 7, 1983-84, pages 68-76. End of that footnote. Footnote 17. Applebaum, The Second Jewish Revolt, A.D. 131-135, page 40. End of footnote. Most went to Babylonia, furthering its growth as a new center of Jewish life and learning. In the land of Israel, now renamed Palestine by the Romans, the Jewish community was rehabilitated in Galilee, which now took over the institutions of Jewish leadership formerly residing in Judea. But Judea itself never completely recovered from the war. Such is the uncertain history of Bar Kokhba, at which modern scholarship has arrived. It provides one way of speaking about him, but not the only way. Perhaps this book should not have begun with the modern historiographical image, so as not to prejudice the reader's response to the earlier literature. My purpose is not to judge the historical accuracy of that literature, but to learn how pre-modern writers constructed history, defined as perceptions of the past, and how the history of Bar Kokhba grew and changed over time. Such a study heightens our awareness of the circumstances shaping our own historical perceptions, the motivations for our study, the resources available to us, the kind of knowledge we hold authoritative, and the worldview by which we judge what is real and important. 3 ideas about the image of Bar Kokhba in Jewish thought. Israelis today debate the political meaning of the story. In 1982, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, an Israeli professor of international relations and a past chief of military intelligence, wrote Vision, Not Fantasy, which became a controversial bestseller in Israel and appeared in American bookstores, translated as the Bar Kokhba Syndrome. In it, Harkabi compared Menachem Begin's political policies with what he saw as the irresponsible zealotry of Bar Kokhba, whom Harkabi charged with dragging the nation into a war of bravado, political fantasy, and national suicide. He asserted that too many Israelis today exhibit an admiration for heroism and rebelliousness detached of responsibility for their consequences. An admiration he termed the Bar Kokhba syndrome, since it often accompanies an unreflective admiration for Bar Kokhba himself. Footnote. Harkabi, Bar Kokhba syndrome, 105, and Chapter 4, Frankel, Bar Kokhba, and all that. See also the American Zionist view of Joseph Sternstein, Judaism 33, 1984, pages 490 to 496. Paul Brains, in Tough Jews, takes Harkabi's side and extends the attack to American Jewish novels that glorify toughness for over-compassion and humanitarian values. End of footnote. Here, then, are two modern images of Bar Kokhba: the popular Israeli image of a glorious national defender, and Harkabi's image of an irresponsible zealot. The book seeks to add historical depth to the debate over the use of military force in the pursuit of Jewish security. Harkabi claims that traditional Jewish literature harshly condemned Bar Kokhba and tried to suppress all memory of him, but Harkabi's evidence is scant and superficially analyzed. He refers briefly to my own research, but my studies suggest that Jewish literature expresses rather a variety and complexity of attitudes toward Bar Kokhba, often holding condemnation and admiration of him together in a complex ambivalence that reflected the ambivalence Jews often felt about political and military power. To my knowledge, only two modern scholars other than Harkabi have written about the image of Bar Kokhba in Jewish thought, and they did so only in brief remarks. Gershom Scholem asserted popular tradition did not subscribe to the rabbinic disparagement of Bar Kokhba's memory. He remained a kind of hero saint. Footnote. Gershom Scholem, Sabbatai Seve, Princetown, 1973, 285. End of footnote. Yigal Yadin identified a different image of Bar Kokhba in popular memory, that of a fighter for national independence. It was centuries of persecution of the Jews and their yearning for national rehabilitation that turned Bar Kokhba into a people's hero, an elusive hero, who they clung to because he had demonstrated that he was the last to demonstrate that Jews could fight to win spiritual and political independence. Footnote. Yadin, Bar Kokhba, 27. End of footnote. The evidence we shall examine, however, supports neither of these generalizations. Who then was Bar Kokhba in Jewish literature? Before he became, in our time, the hero of a nationalist movement, a children's game, and an existentialist novel. The argument of this book. Early rabbinic literature remembered Bar Kokhba in two ways: as an impostor claiming to be the Messiah, and as a glorious military leader whose successes led Rabbi Akiva, one of the great rabbinic authorities of Jewish tradition, to acclaim him the Messiah. These earliest images of Bar Kokhba in Jewish literature form the core of most later perceptions of him, so that he became the prototypical false messiah and one of the great rebels of Jewish history. As such, Bar Kokhba attracted the attention of important Jewish teachers and writers over the centuries because his story touched deeply some of their dearest hopes, their hopes for the Messiah and for national redemption, challenging these hopes as well as strengthening them. His story also interested them for the crucial religious and political issues it raised. Questions of messianic doctrine, of rabbinic authority, and of political policy, the problem of identifying the Messiah, and lessons about the people's relationship with God. The story further spoke of them about specific events occurring in their own day, messianic movements, acts of persecution by Gentiles, especially the expulsion from Spain, and polemical attacks on rabbinic authority and Jewish messianic doctrine. The story of Bar Kokhba sometimes raised political and ethical issues about the use of force, whether war had been the proper course of action, whether Bar Kokhba had used military power, responsibility, and wisely. The opinions expressed in Jewish literature about Bar Kokhba, who is portrayed by the rabbinic legends as a powerful warrior, offer insight into how pre-modern Jews conceived of the role of warriors in Jewish society and how they assessed the value of physical strength and military might. The images of Bar Kokhba that appear in these writings exhibit fascinating features and changes over time. Two earlier rabbinic works, the Jerusalem Talmud and Midrash Lamentations, portray Bar Kokhba with the miraculous powers and the virtues and vices characteristic of the rabbinic image of mighty warriors called Giborim. This image of Bar Kokhba resembles biblical warriors such as Samson and may have also been influenced by Greek and Near Eastern legends about heroes such as Heracles. In the books of two 12th century writers, Ibn Daud and Maimonides, on the other hand, Bar Kokhba assumes the features of a human king acting through natural, Aristotelian political processes. At the end of the 15th century, when Bar Kokhba had become an issue in Jewish-Christian debate, Isaac Abravanel discovers in him a divinely appointed agent of vengeance wielding miraculous powers, perhaps something like the avenging knights of God portrayed in chivalric romances. The 6 Jewish historians of the 16th century who write about Bar Kokhba give him variously the features of a Faustian scholar magician, the ruler of an expanding city-state, a military power in world history, and, in reference to the Spanish expulsion, an avenger upon the Gentiles. From a very different perspective, two Kabbalists of the 16th and 17th centuries perceived Bar Kokhba as one embodiment of the messianic soul during the long course of its rebirths, leading toward full messianic stature. The story has functioned differently in its different contexts. For example, in the Babylonian Talmud, it clarified messianic doctrine and warned against false messiahs. In Midrash Lamentations, the story warned against the political sins of military activism and of rejecting rabbinic leadership. It was recounted on the fast day of the 9th of Av to call for repentance, especially from the sins of overconfidence and distrusting God. Nathan of Gaza, B. 1644, however, the Kabbalist prophet of the Sabbatean Messianic movement, used the story to prove the authenticity of the messianic claims of Shabbatai Tzvi, and to urge Jews to believe in him. Yet the primary lesson that pre-modern Jews drew from the story was that of political quietism. To most writers, the story conveyed a warning not to seek national power by one's own political and military efforts, and a plea to wait for God to initiate redemptive action. At the same time, the story often represented a glorious memory of Israel's past greatness, or a promise of messianic triumph and power in the future. The story of Bar Kokhba has always conveyed several kinds of religious teachings. Not only was it used to clarify messianic doctrine, defend rabbinic authority, and call for repentance, but nearly all the writers told it in such a way as to console readers and reply to doubts about messianic redemption. If Bar Kokhba had failed despite mighty efforts and apparent victory, and the support of Rabbi Akiba with terrible consequences, why should Jews ever trust the messianic promise and its rabbinic promoters? Yet writers succeeded in telling the story in such a way as to neutralize the effects of Bar Kokhba's failure and even to turn it into a cause for new faith. For example, Bar Kokhba's defeat, not by the Romans, but by God, was offered by Midrash Lamentations as a sign that God is still active and ready to redeem Jews when the time is right. Or, according to the Kabbalist, Bar Kokhba's failure meant only that the messianic soul had not as yet fully matured, so that its very incompleteness implied growth and final completion in a full Messiah of later days. This literature does not ignore the dark side of Bar Kokhba, his failure, falsehood, and the disastrous consequences of his rebellion and Rabbi Akiba's mistake. But it shows us how a people struggling to come to terms with this man and through him some of the sins, sorrows, and disappointed hopes of the past. End of introduction.